First of all, I'm really delighted and thrilled to be here at this book launch. Dr. Kelkar has always been a mentor to me and advised me in all my journeys in public life, and Ajay is an old friend and my junior from IIT Bombay. So I think both the authors are known to me for a long time, and I think they and the very distinguished panel that you have after that will really give you a treat. If you're a policy wonk, then this is the ultimate buffet that you can have. I think the book is an extraordinary book because it combines both the theory and practice of policy making. And when I read the book, it sort of brings out to you the sheer range of things that the authors have worked on, and it's incredible. If you look at all the major, I must say almost all the major reforms in India since the maybe early 90s, maybe early 90s, one of these people who's either the author of the book or the panelist has worked on in some way. Dr. Kelkar himself began his journey in reforms when he was Petroleum Secretary. Was that in 91, sir? 95. And Dr. Kelkar, how he became Petroleum Secretary also is a story, but I don't know that I should tell that story. But it's very rare, as you know, for non-IAS guys to become secretaries. And so he had a lot of maneuvers had to be done before he could become Secretary Petroleum way back in 95. But I think when you look at all the substantial reforms done in the petroleum sector, and they're huge, pricing rules, for the first time, India opened up exploration to private companies, the whole NELP, the National New Exploration Licensing Policy of those days, where the ONGC monopoly was essentially removed and more players were brought in, which led to a huge surge in production of oil and gas. All that was done in Mr. Kelkar's first sort of reform stint. And I think he did a couple of very interesting things. He had a committee for reforms, and it was called the R Committee. But he also combined that with a set of people below the age of 30, whom he selected from all the various oil companies. And I thought that was a brilliant move, because by selecting people under the 30 who are working in BPCL, HPCL, IOC, all that, he got officers or managers who had a 20-year, 30-year horizon of the future of the industry. And therefore, they were taking decisions or proposing decisions which would have a long-term impact. And I think that was a absolutely brilliant idea to get young people to lead on the reforms. Now, I don't know how he pulled it off, because we are in a system where if you join the bureaucracy 30 seconds later, he has to call you sir for the rest of your life. So in that system where every minute is counted for seniority, to get 30-year-olds to come up with a long-term vision and make it work was, I think, brilliant idea. And I think I'm not sure why more people are not doing that. And so on and so forth. But one of the things you'll realize about reforms in India is that it's always been a group of committed people working together to make it happen. If you look at the reforms of 1991, it was not just the fact that there was a speech in 1991, but it was because there was a whole body of reforms which are all prepared by various people, Montek Singh Ahluwalia, Padma Desai, there's so many economists of that generation, Shankaracharya, there were lots of them, and they had worked on all these reforms, and finally the collective work of the previous decade of 91 actually came out in the thing, but it was actually due to a long series of prior work done. Similarly, when you look at the extraordinary reforms of the capital markets in the 90s. I think when you look at the capital market reforms of 90s, it was incredible, because it involved setting up regulators like SEBI. It involved setting up new institutions like the National Stock Exchange and the National Stock Depository Limited. It involved defining new rules of market engagement, defining new laws. It was an extraordinary piece of work, and that again was done by a group of very, very talented people in the government, including Mr. Bhave, who was the first head of the NSDL that dematerialized shares and later on became chairman of SEBI. But there were others, there was R.H. Patil, there was PJ Nayak, there was Y.V. Reddy. So there's a whole group of people who came together and cleaned up these capital markets. So again, a great example where you realize that you really need a group of committed people. And who worked together to make these reforms happen. And that's true of every reform that we have had. I think the reforms in pensions, and Ajay was a part of that group, the whole project Oasis, led by S.A. Dave, is actually one of the most remarkable reforms in India which we don't recognize. And that was basically the definition of the new pension system, NPS, and setting up of the pension regulator, the PFRDA, and the most important decision which has never been properly acknowledged, which is that on January 1st, 2004, all government employees of India went from a defined benefit pension system to a defined contribution pension system. This is incredible. I mean, when you look at what's happening all over the world with the costs of in all over the world, the costs of Social Security and Medicare and all these things are just mounting through the roof as you have aging populations. The prescience to realize that that unless we reform our pension system and go from defined benefit to defined contribution is required to prevent a huge loss 20 years down the road was brilliant. And I think that again, Ajay, I think many of you played a role in that. So when you keep looking at all these stories, you realize how important and what a seminal role Dr. Kelkar, Ajay, and Mr. Bhave, KP Krishnan, Mr. Govind Rao all have played. The other important lesson is that these reforms don't happen in a day. They take years to happen. I mean, if you look at the capital market reforms, took nearly 10 years from 1991 to 2002. Pension reforms took 5-6 years. The petroleum reforms took 6-7 years. So these things take time to happen. And because they take time to happen, it's very important that you build a consensus around these reforms, because politicians change, bureaucrats change, and unless you create a larger body of belief around a set of reforms, if it's only dependent on one person and that person gets transferred or promoted or retired, then that's the end of that reform. So I think it's important, and you'll see all these successful reforms that they worked on have had this continuity where people have come together and have like-minded people have a same sense of belief and have stayed together to get things done. And that's been true even in later years. If you look at my own experience on the technology side, if you look at the last 10 years of building Aadhaar, UPI, account aggregator, it's really the same set of people who may have changed their jobs but had a belief in this. Some of them were bureaucrats like Ram Sevak Sharma, Ajay Bhushan Pandey and others. Some were technocrats, technology like Pramod Verma. Some were people running NPCI, Sanjay Jain, many of us here. But they all stayed together and stayed in the belief that this reform is possible. So I think this need to have a group of people, need to understand that it requires time and need to really create a consensus around a set of ideas so that you can outlast political change and outlast bureaucratic change and so on, I think is very important. And then the other important thing is, certainly in India, and it's true probably around the world, the best way to get a reform is to have a crisis, right? So that's generally the accepted model of reforms. The 1991 reform itself, which is the sort of the mother of all reforms, was because of the crisis in the balance of payments and gold being shipped to London and so on, and that led to the reform. But similarly, the capital market reforms, while they were in the works, I think the impetus was the whole Harshad Mehta scam in early '92, and that gave the impetus to create this brilliant architecture of regulators and companies and the whole interoperability that they designed. So I think crisis is very important. I think, I don't know, was the oil thing also because there was a feeling, Dr. Kelkar, that there was a crisis coming, or? Okay, so you're just trying to catch up with the rest of the world. And then I think again, what KP Krishnan is like an encyclopedia for me on government. And I was saying that, okay, we know that 1992 capital market reforms was due to Harshad Mehta. What did Ketan Parekh give us? Ketan Parekh was the next scam. And he said that there was no direct reform of Ketan Parekh, but the fact that there was a scam gave them a chance to sneak in a few more reforms. So that's also another principle, that you have to be opportunistic in this reform business. That is, whenever you get a window of opportunity, you sneak something in, even if it's not related to the problem that happened. So that's what happened with Ketan Parekh. And then, of course, the third one was the NSEL, the commodity scam. And I know it's what? Mehta, Parekh, Shah. I'm not saying anything. I'm not saying anything. I'm not saying anything. I think the thing was that in that case, there was again a case where for years the people had wanted to merge the Forward Market Commission, which was the regulator for commodities, with the SEBI, and massive resistance. In one day, overnight, they merged it. And that was because of that NSEL scam. So I think the point is that crises are important opportunities to drive change. And there's this whole principle of a policy window where you have a policy, you have a certain political need, and you sneak it in. And I think that's been the story of the reforms that we have done. So I think I really can go on and on about the contribution of the two authors. Apart from the work done by Dr. Kelkar on petroleum reforms, he obviously came up with the work on GST, the design of the simple GST. Of course, they didn't follow his advice. But he gave the whole design of a simple GST. The tax reforms, the tax administration, the tax information network came out of a committee which he headed about 15 years back. Then his work on decentralization and the 13th Finance Commission in how to allocate resources between states and center. I mean, there's an unbelievable track record of creating reforms. And similarly, Ajay has been part of many of them, including capital market reforms and as well as the pension. And of course, the whole FSLRC, which he and KP worked together and came out with a complete body of laws for the financial sector, which are getting rolled out. And some of the, I think, ideas have been implemented, like inflation targeting and so on. So I think it's very important also that you have theory and action. So it's think and do. It's not just do something or not just think and leave it on the shelf. It's to think with clarity and cogent sort of intellectual analysis, come out with what should be the framework to be done, and then of course actually execute on that framework in the system. And that's what I think they have all done. So it's remarkable. And of course, Mr. Bhave has gone from both running the NSDL and taking on the incredible challenge of taking India's most antiquated paper-based stock exchange, stock system, and made it completely digital. This was done, and this was done 20 years back. So I think that was another great thing. Then, of course, as chairman of SEBI, he went on to do many more things. So anyway, I think I won't go on. But I think the fundamental thing is that this book captures that, the fact that there is sort of a strategic policy clarity required to do these things. There needs an intellectual foundation. And then there's the act of action, the art of getting these things done, and navigating this in our tortuous and complex Byzantine networks of political intrigue, and still get things done, I think, is really the art of this. And both of these are captured very well in the book. So anyway, I think congratulations, Dr. Kelkar, Ajay, for this wonderful book. And we'll have a great session now with Dr. Kelkar, Ajay, KP Krishnan, Mr. Bhave, and of course the great economist Govind Rao, who's also been part of the Finance Commission. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nandan, for that great introduction to the book. I'm going to go straight to the panelists. And I thought it would be a good idea to get impressions from Krishnan about what does a civil servant feel when he reads a book like this. Is this something that works? It doesn't work? And unfortunately, we can't just dismiss it as work done by academicians who do not know anything about administration, because Dr. Kelkar has worked through the same bureaucracy that we have worked through. So let me hand over this task to Krishnan.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Good evening to you, sir. And let me first thank you both for the book. It's a lovely book which has been, I think, it's been waiting to be written. I'm glad you wrote it, sir. I'll come straight to your question, sir. I'll answer the sort of the relevance of the book, if you permit, with an example. And the example that I want to quote is a piece that appeared on the 2nd of February in the Hindu, written by a professor of the Delhi School of Economics, no less, Harvard trained. It's on the budget. And he talks about, he quotes the FM and says the FM in her speech said the importance of skilling, gives examples of paramedical and teaching professionals and the need for India to do more, and then concludes with a very sort of lament that only 3,000 crores have been provided for this very important task. Now, purely a couple of sort of interesting facts. In the last 5 years, the Ministry of Skill Development has not utilized lesser amounts that have been provided. Minor point, we'll ignore it. Two, the 3,000 crores that he talks about is actually a complete misnomer. There are 21 ministries of Government of India which actually do skill development, and the total provision is actually 11,000 crores. Again, minor fact, we'll ignore it. But let's come to public policy, the core issue here. What's our standard answer to sort of any serious problem? Skill development is a serious problem, needs action. Action 1, create a ministry. Action 2, just load it with budget. Because spending money will solve the problem. And all you need to do is just dig a little deeper. Unlike conventional education, skill and vocations is primarily something where less than 30% is classroom, 70% plus is not even in a lab, but in the premises of the employer. You become a good chef after learning the chemistry, the biology, by actually going into the kitchen. And you become a good beauty wellness operator by actually working in the beauty wellness workplace. So the world over, serious skilling is actually closely linked to apprenticeship. Dig a little deeper. Apprenticeship is regulated in India, there is an act, and no major employer, Tata's or Maruti, you will find a shortage of skilling. But let's do what Kelkar and Ajay tell us to do. 87% of India's employment is in entities that employ less than 5 people. Street corner Anthony Garage, likely to be semi-legal because he's squatting on public land, probably stealing electricity, cheating on GST. Now, getting this guy or this entity to engage with government to do apprenticeship is not an expenditure problem. And yet, you have learned authors spent a lifetime doing economics, recommending what should be obvious to you as the wrong answer to a serious problem if you read, I think, the first chapter of this book. I'll stop here, sir.
May I now request Mr. Govind Rao, because he has a very interesting position. He is kind of outside government and inside government. So as NIPFP, you are part of government, yet you are not government. So his perspective on the book.
Can I watch that? Oh, sure. Like to have some blood circulation. Oh, okay. Yeah. Thank you. At the outset, let me thank Dr. Kelkar and Shah for giving me this opportunity to read and comment on the book. So I'll be possibly speaking more about the book and some various messages it gives. Of course, I've had known Dr. Kelkar for a long, long time, and I had committed a serious crime of hiring Ajay in the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, despite several hostile sort of references. So I'm glad that I have to be talking on the book that he has co-authored. Let me say that this is an extremely important book, giving a fresh insight into a number of policy matters. It explains the governments have a role to intervene when the markets fail, but not to compete with the markets. And then when you're doing that, so first thing that you need to do is for a government intervention, you have to first ask question whether there is a market failure. If there is no market failure, there is no need for the government to come in. And if there is a market failure, then the next question that you need to ask is, what is the right type of intervention that you want to have? You can own and run, or you can regulate, or you can do many things. So what is the right type of intervention? And the third thing that you really require to do is whether you have the capacity to do this intervention, and if you don't have the capacity, how do you develop the capacity? Now I am reminded of a beautiful article by Mansur Olson, who basically did a beautiful book on logic of collective action way back in the mid-60s. This paper was in 1993. It's called Dictatorship, Democracy and Development. The basic message that comes, basically why do you need a government? And in fact, it starts from there. Basic message that comes is that early 20th century, you had a large number of roving bandits in China. And obviously, when there are roving bandits, there is no incentive to save, incentive to invest, incentive to grow. And it is around that an invisible hand works. And there was a very strong roving bandit called Feng Yu Xiang, who decided that he will settle down. He will tell the people around that he will protect them. And then, of course, they should give a constant share of their incomes. And then you move from anarchy to dictatorship, from roving banditry to a stationary bandit. And the stationary bandit protects them because it is in his interest to protect them, because he will get his money if there is an incentive for him to protect them. So there is saving, there is investment, there is growth. And then, obviously, his incentive is only to look after those people who have the means and who gives him. So there is no encompassing interest there, and therefore Mansur says that you need to move to a participatory democracy. Well, I don't know what happens when you move to a participatory democracy, but the basic message is that basic function of the government is to protect the life and property of the people and enforce the contracts. And if you do not, that comes, it comes very clearly. If you don't have it, you have an anarchic sort of a situation. Now, as I said, as Krishnan said, the book begins with the role of the state. The mainstream view is that state is benevolent, and whenever you have a problem, state should come in. Here again, I am reminded of a fascinating discussion between two stalwarts in public finance. There was a symposium in University of Munich in 1998 between Richard Musgrave and James Buchanan, a week-long symposium. And Richard Musgrave was always thinking of the government as a benevolent entity, and Buchanan always said that state, state actually impinges on the freedom of the individuals. It constrains the freedom of the individuals. You should limit the role of the state. There was a contrasting views. The entire thing is put out in a book by Buchanan and Musgrave, and the book is called Public Finance and Public Choice, Two Contrasting Views of the State. In fact, I did mention this after he wrote the thing. There are quite a few insights in the book. One of the things is that the major market failure happens because of the public good, because people don't reveal preferences for the public good because of its technical characteristics. And therefore, the governments have to come in and provide. Now, public good is provided, in the scheme that they have according to the individual preference of the people aggregated. But then what do you do with the education and healthcare, where the technical characteristic of a public good doesn't do? That is where Musgrave comes and says that, we need to have what is called the merit goods. The concept of a merit good comes because they are so meritorious that the government thinks that it is important to provide them at a minimum quantity. So, public good I decide, but the merit goods the government decides. What defense I have to, we need for the country, I decide. But how much of education my children should have will be decided by the government. There is a basic contradiction. So when these things were pointed out, Buchanan very beautifully says, I don't understand this, this merit good at all. Because anything can be a merit good. You can stretch merit good to any extent to justify anything, including government trading in alcohol. Because you will say that it is important that people should get good quality alcohol, and then you can go about, basically, intervening in the government. And so there is quite a lot of very vibrant, literature on this. And obviously, Kelkar and Shah bring it to the dining table of the individual household, this particular discussion. And that's the most important issue, what the government should really be doing, and what we should be expecting, why it should interfere in areas where it doesn't really have the competence, and these are the important issues that they think. As I said, the government has to intervene where the markets fail. It has coercive power and constrains individual freedom. It has capacity and power to coerce, inflict violence, and constrain individual freedom. So when does really government has to do? And they were very clear. They said, in the case of providing public goods, just as Buchanan says, I agree that the public good should be provided, but then don't go beyond. Basically that is that. So Kelkar and Shah talk about the public good, asymmetric information, externalities, and of course, there are issues of redistribution. Markets don't redistribute. Now the question is, what is the type of redistribution that you want to do? Once Buchanan said that you redistribute, give lump sum money to them, and once you give lump sum money to them, they will decide whether they should spend on education or healthcare or whatever, and don't bring in this concept of a merit code. Let the parents decide what they want to do with that money. You give the... Well, we have been talking about minimum cash transfer, minimum basic income and things like that, but then there is a role for, because the markets fail, there is a role for redistribution. But at the same time, we need to really understand that reducing the incomes of the rich does not increase the incomes of the poor. This is something which we have, the socialistic sort of a thing that we have gone through. Reducing the incomes of the rich does not increase the incomes of the poor. And obviously, poverty elevation is different from changing the income distribution. You ask Abhijit Banerjee, he is all the time worried about the income distribution. Now, the problem is income distribution is not the thing. In fact, on one occasion, when he was trying to use the income tax data to get the, look at the income distribution, I had warned him that not to do, because those days income tax statistics were so bad. So what happened is that he listened to me, and then after 3 years, I see an article in Journal of Macroeconomics where he says, I am most grateful to Govind Rao for very useful discussions on the data. Now, so Kelkar Shah analysis leads them to conclude clearly that sick enterprises must die, there should be an exit, and there should be an exit clear, because they can't be kept on ventilator forever. Interventions result in ripple effects. Any rationale for intervention or assessment of effects should take into account general equilibrium effects. This is very, very interesting things come in. A few years ago, there was a fashion to say that, computer chips, yes, potato chips, no. I think it should be the reverse. The point is very simple. In potato chips, you may have comparative advantage. In computer chips, you didn't. Why did you have to really restrict people from producing potato chips and selling it? Similarly, recently on the GST, in fact, there was a very interesting thing when Arun Jaitley ji said, Hawaii Chapel and Mercedes car are not the same. But Hawaii Chapel doesn't have any forward linkages in terms of producing, employment. The question is, you need to take into account. Way back in 1956, Arnold Harberger wrote a beautiful article that, called Incidence of Corporation Tax, wherein he said, tax on capital in an open economy may turn out to be a tax on labor. And obviously when you reduce the corporation tax and getting rid of all the things, there is so much of this, sort of noise that is made. And what happens if all the capital goes out? Who loses? It's the labor that loses. There are a number of, they do point out a number of paradoxes, number of, unintended effects of the type of policy that you have. You have, APMC Act, which was which has created a behemoth, a monopoly of the, which was supposed to trade, to give access to markets, but then it has created a monopoly of traders. Then you have Rent Control Act. It's supposed to protect the interest of the tenants, but it actually, the entire rental housing simply, goes away. And there are, there are a variety of this type of things that they point out. A number of policy interventions that have gone astray because you don't really foresee all the effects of these policy interventions. And but finally, before I conclude, I just want to say one thing. If somebody thinks that this book is for a bedtime reading, please forget it, because it's too heavy. There are 400 pages in the book. And so you will have to sit on the dining table and read and then discuss with your friends and relatives. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Rao. I'm going to begin by asking a few questions so that we take the discussion from the book to the authors. One of the things that interested me, and Dr. Kelkar was part of that reform. So it's not just when he was Petroleum Secretary that he was part of reforms, but prior to that he was the economic advisor, economic policy and planning advisor in Petroleum Ministry. And in 1985, for the first time, the government of India opened up blocks for exploration by other than Oil India and ONGC. So that is the first time when monopoly was broken. But that's not the point. The point is that when the first set of notes were prepared for this purpose, cabinet note, there was never any doubt in the minds of either Dr. Kelkar or Mr. Ramakrishna that these blocks have to be auctioned. That is how the note went. It got passed. There was no political opposition to that. What intrigues me is that around 91 or 92, so a good 6-7 years after that, coal was opened up. But we decided to allot coal on the basis of nomination. Both are wealth that is under the ground, so we do not know how much there is. The characteristics are not very different. They are part of the same group of so-called energy ministries. So Ministry of Power, Ministry of Coal, Ministry of Petroleum. They have a lot of exchange amongst themselves. Why doesn't one government department learn from the other? I'm sure you people have thought about it. So in this whole policy planning, why does it happen that we fall between the cracks?
It's on. That is a very important issue you raised, and I have a hypothesis, I may be wrong. Essentially, the difference between coal and oil is one is broadly non-tradable, the other is tradable. It makes a lot of difference how you pursue industry. This is one. Second, one is extremely labor intensive. If you remember the size of labor unions, size of political factors involved were very different in coal industry than in oil industry. Third, I think if you see historically, after great battle, coal was nationalized, political battle. So then making any further changes, I suppose, would have been far more difficult. Compared to oil was much simpler because oil was always part of the state, especially I'm talking upstream sector. So I think they're just very different. They may look energy, like for substitute, but all the important characteristics which are important for politics of it are very different. So you found, and of course, to answer an issue raised indirectly by Nandan, one credit must go to our ministers. The political leadership is very important. You had in Petroleum Ministry much maligned minister called Captain Satish Sharma, but he was far more committed to reforms than his counterpart in coal industry. So it's a political leadership which is committed to reform also counts. So the committed politician has a lot of space if he wants to exploit it. But there has to be other, as there's a real nature, the industry should be supportive. And coal is just too before it.
Can I say something on
Yeah,
this?
yeah, sure.
Not entirely the same set of issues, but same committed political master, namely the same finance minister, the department that you dealt with, the Department of Economic Affairs, versus the Department of Financial Services. The entire equity market reforms is a story which Nandan referred to. You see what is the Harshad Mehta scam was a banking scam, banks and RBI fiddling around with accounting of government securities. It had nothing to do with capital markets as you understand. DFS didn't move 1 inch and hasn't moved 1 inch since then. I think it is something to do with DFS thinks ownership, because it's the owner of public sector banks. So they think appointment, vigilance clearance, sitting on boards, foreign visit approvals. So it's a very different DNA, and the same guys, and we have identical examples. The recent author of Going Public, your successor in SEBI, in DFS, and his own role in DEA, same individual, PJ Nayak, banking and capital markets. He wrote the NSDL, the Depositories Act, but in DFS, he did very little on ownership. So I think there is something to do with DNAs of departments also. And I think it's worth exploring. We've done a little bit of that. We are digging out all the files. We've done RTI of all the files. Soon we'll, I think, have some interesting answers.
Okay, interesting. So there's no such thing as DNA of government, but we have DNA of departments, and we need to deal with that. Interesting point. The other issue, on reading your book, you've emphasized decentralization a lot. But what I couldn't figure out is, and you must have given a thought to this, surely there must be certain things that are better done through centralization. So just this thought comes to my mind. If we had left the regulation of stock exchanges to respective states, and we would have had 23 SEBIs, is it possible that we would have had a better outcome? I don't know. We are experimenting actually in the field of RERA. So we have 25 regulators all over the country. Each state has appointed a regulator. And we will actually have an experience in terms of a real life experiment, whether that is going to produce a better thing, or is it that there are certain things that inherently by their nature are good if they're centralized and good if they're decentralized. So is there such a thing?
It's exactly as you said. So in economics, we use a phrase, the subsidiarity principle, which says that you should put functions as low as possible. But of course, as you mentioned, there are things that really are logically placed at a higher level. I find it fascinating to think about education for a moment, because there are different pieces of the education puzzle which work effectively at different elements of the system. For example, imagine curriculum development. Curriculum development is not very local. Okay, you want to devise a mathematics curriculum. You want to run testing. These are things that are reasonably general and work on a higher level, and that makes sense to put it up at the union government. But if you want to run the operations procedures of regulating schools, of financing through vouchers, of running schools, then these kinds of things go better at a local government. So I think one has to think in a sensible way about each of these. But the plea in the chapter is that India could use a lot more decentralization than is presently the case.
To answer your particular question about stock exchange versus RERA, anything in the activities which has national externalities, economy-wide, has to be done by centrally. Now, stock exchanges have national externalities, so that's the reason. I mean, very broad way, what should come at national level and what could, and in my view, it is going to be extremely important of decentralization. India is going to grow in cities, and the way cities are being governed, which is a good example how not to do things. They don't have fiscal base. They don't have autonomy of appointing a CEO. The most highly paid executive in China, some years back, was a chief manager of the city of Shanghai. So today, Bangalore Corporation wants to hire their commissioner or general manager. He would be, you don't get people then. So we require much greater decentralization if you want urbanization process to really be done more efficiently.
Well, I don't think anybody says that you should decentralize everything. Macroeconomic stability or redistribution has to be done at the central level. It's only the provision of public services, sort of allocation function that has to be done. And even there, the basic idea of decentralization is that you are able to find out, you are able to elicit different preferences of people in different jurisdictions. And, different, depending upon the cost factors, where the costs are, there are scale economies. But, the literature again says, there's a beautiful book by Albert Breton, which talks about competitive governments. And in this competitive government, he basically says, in fact, he was one of the earliest to talk about differential preferences and decentralization. But in this particular book, he says, if you are able to decentralize, and if you are able to, at the central level, if you are able to elicit the preferences everywhere, if your technology permits that, if you are able to standardize the provision, decentralization, and then if you are able to save the cost, decentralization is not only not necessary, but wasteful. But there is another side to it. In a sense, I think that, apart from many other things, the general principle of decentralization fits in. In fact, that's also Brennan Buchanan sort of a position that, central government can become a behemoth. Okay? So in order to control the central government, you need the decentralization. That's a different view altogether. Anyway.
I think in a sense, European Union is a good example. There are certain things that they have voluntarily agreed need to be centralized, and they are traveling more and more in that direction. And we are probably the opposite example, where we started with a very strong center, and now we have demands for greater decentralization. We don't know where the equilibrium will be. You talk in your book a lot about what kind of people are required in framing policy. And one or two characteristics that you emphasize there are, for example, teamwork. So you need people who are able to operate in teams, are able to understand that different people are coming from different viewpoints, yet as a team we need to produce a good result. And you also make a point that government should not try to change people. And that's not part of your economic policy, this thing. But the issue that arises in my mind is that at least at the time when we were educated, all through my academic years, nowhere was I given any credit whatsoever for teamwork. It was always individual performance. And then after finishing 23 years of education, I'm suddenly told now you must have team spirit in you. So unless the government thinks about this, changes the way education is delivered, which is changing, but unless the government intervenes here, don't you think there is some role for government to change this? And the other issue that is not very much discussed is, why don't we have emphasis on ethics in our schools? And do we need intervention there? Because if we are going to suddenly expect that people at the age of 24 are going to be extremely ethical, as you rightly say, people respond to incentives. But these incentives are not necessarily monetary. If they were merely monetary, no civil servant would be honest. But they are honest because they have some idea of honor, some idea of why they have come into public service, and so on. So there are non-monetary incentives that operate, and people respond to those incentives. Then isn't it one of the government's functions to be trying to create a better society through better training of people? So is that always true, that government must not try to change anything?
Before Ajay's response to it, I want to give a private joke between me and Ajay. Wherever in the government, whenever any problem, let's just get Chandu to do it. Because he is a great team builder and team leader. So that was sort of always a one point solution. No, I think you raised an important issue. And, other day we had a debate. My grandson is here, and he plays cricket. And we believe that, Lata is a student counselor, so she believes that his playing cricket itself is very important, because that gives her values. And I also seen that people who play team sports are a different kind of leaders and different kind of. So you're probably right that what we give education. I'm not an expert on pedagogy, but sample size of one, him, my grandson, I see a distinct what he as a team player makes him, and compared to others.
Yeah, so I just have two responses to what you said. The first is to underline what Nandan was describing, that successful areas of work in India have always involved large communities. Okay, so the phrase we use in the book is an alpine-style assault versus a siege-style assault. Okay, in an alpine-style assault, two guys try to put on a backpack and run up Mount Everest. And while that's a very romantic thing to do, and in the modern media, we will always tell stories about these great heroes, and the media is filled with a great man theory of history. In fact, doing things requires many people. Many people have to come together and do things and be able to stay interested in a subject on a sustained basis. And that requires all of us to be good to each other, to be able to support each other in moments of despair, and to be able to respect the presumption of good faith about the other person, even when there are many differences. And I think this is a very important learning for us as a community in India, because I think too often we have been very mean to each other and very rude to each other in the policy community. And I think that we all mean well. We should give each other the presumption of good faith, and by being able to talk to each other, it will help greatly. My second comment is to continue where you were about the problem of what motivates a civil servant, and I know you and I have spoken about this many times in the past. I want to link this to the great debate between what is called the managerialism of new public management versus the problem of a professional ethos. Okay, so in new public management, we want to reduce an employee into a robot. Okay, we wish to think that we will put extremely intrusive monitoring, we'll put a sensor on every employee, we will track them moment to moment, we'll put a body cam on the policeman, and out of that we'll create incentives to make people behave better. Okay, so our dream somewhere in there is that of a factory, an assembly line, a BPO operation where we crush individual agency and convert human beings into robots. And that is effective in its own way. It is a way of organizing large teams into production, and that has its merits. People like Land Pritchett have always argued that this is a relatively limited vision, and my intuition is it gets India to make progress compared to where we are, because the behavior of frontline civil servants in India is often abysmal, and God knows a lot more intrusive measurement and more sensors and more monitoring can only help. But it doesn't take you much beyond, because a lot of the work of civil servants is deeply discretionary and it requires a professional ethos. So Lant always emphasizes that there is a hierarchy of needs, and what works in building capability in a civil service is really the respect of peers. And he pushes on the concept of accountability. There are two alternative ways to think about the words accountability. Accountability can be viewed in a mechanical way as accounting, where you say, I spent 8 hours, I did this, I spent so much money, and I am asked by a superior authority to give an account of how I utilized my time and money. The other notion of accountability is that I've given account, a narration to my peers about what were the puzzles I faced, what I did, and I feel obliged to explain to my peers about the struggles that I went through and the journey that I walked on, and I did some things right and I did some things badly, and I need my peers to value and respect what I did and excuse me and forgive me for the mistakes that I made, and respect me and admire me for the things that I did right. This is also all embedded in the English word accountability. And Lant emphasizes that at an early stage of development, you can do a lot of good things in government by industrializing the workforce. But it only takes you so far. To go further, we've got to come back to a public service orientation and people who care about doing good by the people. And that's a very difficult transition. We in India are mostly at the easy part. We need a lot more industrialization of the civil service today. But it is going to peter out as we go forward.
Okay, my last question, and then we'll open it to the audience. Last question. After this, we'll open to the audience. I joined CB in 1992 while I was still in the civil service on a secondment basis. And I had zero knowledge of stock markets. So I told the chairman, Mr. G.V. Ramakrishna, that I don't know anything about stock markets, and if you still want me there, then for first 3 to 6 months, I will not be able to do anything, because I just need to first understand what this beast is all about. So I got the opportunity to go through all the old reports that had been produced on stock market reforms. There was the Fairwani Committee, there was the G.S. Patel Committee, and the government files. Since I was still in the civil service, I had access to government files as well. We were full of notes of what needs to be done. The overwhelming feeling at that time was that we have done enough analysis. Now we need somebody to implement this. There's no need to further look into it. Many wise people have gone into these issues, and the path is fairly clear. And when you look at different areas that need reform in India, you can't escape the feeling that a lot of work has already been done. Unfortunately, we don't have people who will go ahead and implement what requires to be done. So while I respect what you've said in the book, that paralysis by analysis is not a very good phrase. Issues need to be looked into in a deeper sense. But when you look at the amount of time we have spent on what reform is required, you cannot escape the feeling that we need to go and do something about it. There's no point in going on talking about it. I mean, judicial reform is an excellent example. Everybody knows what needs to be done. We have no idea of how to do it. It's just not getting done. The judicial system stays where it is. It is a minimum of 25 or 30 years before civil litigation gets decided. So what went through your mind with regard to this? Did you feel that for next 20 years, India doesn't need to think about all the policy issues? It needs to just implement what it has already thought through. Would that be an appropriate response?
I don't think so. I think the world is changing very rapidly. I mean, the kind of problems which are occurring, I would just give one example. In fact, one of the lacuna of this book that, inshallah, if we get next edition, Ajay probably would write on this, is climate change. climate change is one of the major policy issues which are all the characteristics of a good policy issue which needs to be handled with proper. And they're not adequate analysis. We don't have enough work done. We don't have enough understanding, in my view. So, so I don't think, maybe it's true, particular issue is discussed. But even there, Chandu, the importance is of leadership. I'll give you a simple example and then I'll give. You know, when we did the tax reform, we proposed tax reform network. Now, according to one of the calculations made by Professor Govind M Rao himself, he says, Nandan, he says, according to TIN alone, increased tax GDP ratio of 150 basis points. So it was essentially, it happened only because Jaswant Singh as a minister. Everything was there. I remember discussion was going on, and CBD chairman said, sir, if you implement this, the entire revenue machinery will go on strike. Now, mind you, we are not taking risks. I mean, we are just, our report based on NSDL was, whole thing was mapped out. Also, Mohan was there. But finally, it took the leader to decide. And I still remember Mr. Jaswant Singh looked at the chairman. He said, let them go ahead. Let them go on strike. After all, what I'm asking you to do, I'm just, put it very nicely. He said, I'm just taking the Hamali from them. I'm not taking away their right to enforcement. I'm not taking the right away to analysis of the data. It's being outsourced to Indian company, Indian institution. So it takes leadership. So many times you may have a lot of analysis, but final crunch comes, I think, is that man counts who take the decision. Without him, we would not have seen, we could not have increased our tax GDP ratio at all. So, and then leaders are extremely important. The leadership, everywhere I've seen, take the example of the, in my view, the golden age of policy was when Vajpayee was the Prime Minister. There you saw team spirit. He led the team. He allowed decentralization. He had a vision and willingness to take risk, which many of the reforms were destabilizing politically. So it's a combination of everything, and it just again, Nandan, it was not crisis-driven reforms. That time there was no crisis, but he had a vision. He had understanding of his own way. He had understanding, and it was. Before I give back to, I just want to mention that one of the important points we have made in this book is now, if you think of India's economic history, independent India, broadly there are two policy parva. First one led by Nehru, when we want to transform colonial economy to increase completely, dramatically growth. It went on and it ran out, its steam, went to crisis. Second parva was in 1991. And then sub-part of that was Vajpayee, 97, 98. But we are arguing that even that is now petered out. Since 2011, there's a growth recession. And the whole book is an attempt to understand why it happened and what are the ways of bringing the third wave, or third, we call Mark III of the reform or policy agenda. And this sort of contribution towards that, because we recognize, as you mentioned, Lance Pritchard has worked on it, Vivek Debro has worked on it, Pratap Mehta has worked on it. It's a work by political scientists, the historians, by sociologists, and of course economists. So this is really the next parva, so to speak, of India's growth journey and what needs to be done for our new problems.
You don't remember this, but I first met you in September 1993. And I don't have the date. And we did this high-level conversation about what's broken about Indian financial markets. And you told me a story there about key elements we need to think differently about putting investors first, putting consumer protection, the role of order matching, the problem of fair play in the brokerage, about separating out the derivatives trading from the spot, about a clearing corporation that was a counterparty. That was not in all the committee reports. That was in your head. So I've read all the committee reports. So you built a synthesis out of your world about the people around you, the things that you saw. For example, the developmental stage from 88 onwards, where Dave and Ravi Narayan were building the non-statutory SEBI. You will recall that in the 1984 G.S. Patel committee report, there is a thanks in the acknowledgements to an obscure junior staffer from IDBI who was a technical secretariat for that committee. He was R.H. Patil. Okay? So that's how we build knowledge, that's how we build capability. It took those years of figuring it out. And you know, a project like OTCI, how it floundered and failed. It was an attempt at doing something. It is the ideas were wrong, the concepts were wrong. And it is when those ideas came together that we were actually ready to do it. So I think there was a learning process in that story. The execution was not far ahead of the ideas. The execution was only this much behind the ideas. It wasn't that the key insights of the early 90s had actually been laid through the 80s. It was literally in the early 90s that the pieces came together. The VSAT opportunity was not there until the early 90s.
Yeah, not directly on this, but since Dr. Kelkar mentioned about another edition of this book coming later, I have, there are one area where I think a little more exploration is needed is the role of special interest groups in sabotaging the entire scheme of things. In fact, state is not able to provide the public good that it should. If you say that it doesn't have the capacity, that is also a part of the special interest group politics. Now, state is completely non-transparent. You look at the budget. In fact, all the numbers are fictitious. Why? Why? Because you still follow you don't follow the accrual accounting. You tell the private sector that they should have the double entry bookkeeping, but you will continue to do this because you can manipulate the numbers. Okay? Now, there is nothing like a conflict of interest in the government. There is nothing like an insider trading in the government. All this is because, we did talk about coal. Now, there is a major special interest group. You might, there may be some leaders who might, do something, but there's a much larger issue that needs to be tackled. And I think that would require another volume. Thank you.
Right, we'll take questions, sir. I have some, but I'll come back to it later. You should take questions.
We'll open this to the audience. My request is that please identify yourself, and there are mics going around. Yeah. Please state your question as briefly as you can.
Hello. Hello. My name is Sameer. Sorry. So I have a question. You mentioned in one of the chapters that the ideal rate for GST should be a low rate. It should be a flat single rate GST, and it should be across the board. However, we know the reality that GST rates are in slabs. So do you believe that by setting these rates in a slab, like 5% for one commodity, 18%, 28%, have we willingly or unwillingly allowed industries to lobby for lower rate GSTs? And have we effectively killed, a possibility of a single rate ever being achieved in the next half a decade or a decade to go forward? Thank you.
The argument which we are given for the single rate is essentially comes from the fact that you design your policies reflect the state capacity to handle a complex system. And single rate was the most simple. So then later on you can always, if you want to complicate it. And we are given the data since 1995, about 80% of the countries adopt a single rate. So single rate has a tremendous advantage of simplicity. And also, suppose we have argued that suppose we were wrong, that it was too low and you had sort of revenue shortfall, you could always increase it later on. So it's not as if that one may take a revenue hit, but it is much easier to comply. Compliance cost goes down because we have argued that one of the most important in tax administration is compliance cost of taxpayer. So that also. Now the reason why multiple are probably, one of my hypotheses would be that, and we have discussed in this book, that India is increasingly become administrative state. Namely, it is ruled by officials. And I mean, that's one of the interest group which perhaps Govind Rao was implying, that they also affect policies. So officials also became interest group, which had an interest different than what the interest of the economy is. And that's one explanation why yours is multiple rates, because they put fear of revenue shortfall and, in a way, I always found politicians are far more willing to innovate and experiment. It's the civil servants, the officials, who like discretion, who like caution. And that's one reason why. And if you remember, we were involved with not only one bureaucracy, center and 27 state bureaucracies. So the interest group mentioned were very powerful in this regard.
I just want to supplement what you said. See, 81% of the countries which have moved over to a GST since 2005 have moved over to a single rate GST. This is Michael Keane in his analysis. Now, one of the reasons why you would want a single rate is that you don't allow the people to lobby around and ask for a lower rate. Now, but then the problem here is that, you had a committee under the chief economic advisor, which basically talked about 3 rates, but then they were not sure of calculating the revenue. They said, so we will have a 40% rate for certain items. Now, when the chief economic advisor comes up and then gives a recommendation like this, so obviously sort of bureaucrats and politicians will take, succor, because they want, they like more and more administration. Let me put it this way. But, and then of course, one was hoping that, you had 2 rates in the case of state value-added tax. Broadly, they had converged the number of rates in the case of excise. And then there was 1 rate of tax in service. They could have, finally, it was imperative, because much of European Union except Norway has 2 rates of tax. Norway is the only country there with 1 rate of tax. At least you would have moved over to 2 rates of tax, and you would have had a good, sort of system of looking at afresh how you really fit it. You have a fitment committee. There's 4 rates were given, and this fitment committee, comprising of 2 joint secretaries of Central Board of Indirect Taxes and some officials of the state government, basically deciding where a commodity or a service should go into these 4 categories. And there is absolutely no analysis. I think it's it's a complete disaster in that sense of the term. Thank you.
And if I may just add to that, Mr. Bhave, can I just do one sentence? It worries me enormously when these things are being done by officials and not by legislators. Drafting law should have a dominant role of legislators.
My name is Jairaj. I have a question for the panel, which is, from your experience, what constitutes good regulation? Because there are sectors in the economy that are very poorly regulated today, and there are sectors of the economy that may be better regulated. So is it the law? Is it the regulator? Is it the support from the ministry? Or is it the acquiescence of the private sector which has to be regulated? I request your comments on that.
So the answer is a long one, but in short, it's probably a lot of this but it starts with the law, because we use the word regulation, at least in the sense in which the book uses it, to mean something more than routine government activity. The word regulation is used in the book typically to mean all three functions of the state, namely legislative, executive, and judicial, all rolled into one agency. It's actually the Trimurti, which is fundamentally anathema to the whole idea of checks and balances and separation of powers. And I think a lot of the problems that you see in Indian regulation, cutting across sectors, whether it's telecom, whether it's financial sector, whether it's electricity, whether it's RERA, it is these three the combination of these three functions in one entity without adequate accountability, which is, I think, at the heart of the problem. But there are aspects of the other problems that you mentioned. I mean, there is inadequate capacity, part of what was explained by Dr. Govind Rao. They've almost entirely been bureaucratized. So there's a whole series of problems, but if it were a multiple choice question with one answer, then it's the law, because the law is the DNA of the regulator.
Can Mr. Bhave comment on it?
Yeah, sure. I think I'll just supplement Krishnan's point. So when the CB Act was passed by the Parliament, it had a lot of deficiencies. But the one thing it did very clearly was done in the preamble, not in the actual sections of the Act. And it said that a mechanism to develop and regulate markets in the interest of investors. I think if you get your focus right, then probably most of the issues are solved. And the good part of how SEBI has been administered by bureaucrats as well as non-bureaucrats is that that has been put into the DNA of people, that at the core the issue is, are investors' interests being protected or not? And that emphasis and that clarity has helped a lot in SEBI becoming a regulator that I may have a conflict of interest here, is classified as one of the better regulators in the financial landscape.
I have a question. This is Venki. This is on the decentralization of policy making or the policy implementation. So do you think this would work only if there is also a decentralization on resources? For example, if you look at the urban governance, where the taxes are being collected vis-a-vis where the spend is happening. So in other words, if you don't pair them up, do you think the decentralization of just one part of the puzzle would work? And follow-up question is, if you need to do decentralization in a big way, do you think certain pilots can be implemented, and which part of the economy where the decentralization could be tested out?
I'll come to issue of, give an example of urbanization as an important issue of decentralized governance. Today, our urban areas, the urban governments don't have adequate fiscal base. And one of the arguments made in this book is that it's very important to give fiscal base to urban bodies, or urban local bodies. And one proposal we have given is, and which has been argued in our report, in Finance Commission report also, that the GST is a good tax which can be shared with the third tier. It's a consumption tax, so it beautifully aligns the demand and supply for governance, because if it's the interest of the governor to have large tax base, namely like large consumption, so he's going to improve the supply of governance. Simply demand for governance goes up because everybody is a taxpayer, because you're paying from And if you want a concrete example how it helps, just look at Mr. Kejriwal. He is an urban body with access to GST. So he has much larger resources the way he wants to spend. And he is doing much more better than many other cities in the area of health and education and other local public goods. So you're absolutely right, greater funds availability, I'm not saying it solves all the problem, but it will certainly improve the urban governance and supply of urban public goods and accountability of the urban administration. So I think it will come, I have no doubt in my mind. Looking at Kejriwal's example, I'm sure people are going to wake up. That's why he's winning. One of the reasons is because of access to resources.
I just want to supplement again. One is, as I said, in many cities they used to have octroi, in Bombay in particular. And obviously all these have been, or enter tax, all these have been subsumed in GST. But what have they done to even Mumbai? They have said that, taking 2015-16 base, they said that they will give something like 4% escalation every year. Whereas they are demanding 14% escalation from the center. I mean, this is the fact. That's one. No, I'm not saying, I'm not justifying the existence of the octroi. And as far as, there are also, I mean, obviously, in the Kelkar's task force report, they did mention that 1%, sort of GST, this thing should be charged and they should be given to the urban local governments. But even there, one of the basic problems with the, decentralization is its birth defect. And the birth defect is that you have, in the constitution, in the state subject, you have entry 5, which says entire local governments will be state's responsibility. And then you have Schedule 11 and Schedule 12, which basically lays down saying that the states may, at their discretion, pass on these functions to them. Now, and states have no interest. If you really look at it. And where is the administrative decentralization? The municipal commissioner is a state government employee. They can't employ their own people. That's where, there are serious issues of that nature. But as far as the resources are concerned, in fact, there is something called a profession tax, which is supposed to go to them. It was fixed at 2,500 rupees in 1988, ceiling. Constitution allows. Now, we in the 14th Finance Commission suggested that it change it to 12,000 rupees. Now, the union government just kept quiet and the states are not interested. Now, if you change it to 12,000 rupees, quite a lot of money would come to them, you would find. You have a Rent Control Act in Mumbai. Property tax cannot be levied because the the Rent Control Act, this thing. So you have series of problems with, every urban, agglomeration. But I think GST, a share of GST, at least some portion of it would do a lot of good.
Yeah. Good evening, my name is Prashant. The question to the panel is on policy U-turns. And the context is I read an article this morning which says that Kia Motors is looking to relocate its manufacturing plant outside Andhra Pradesh to Tamil Nadu because the new AP government is thinking of introducing some policies which will make it probably unviable. So what could be done, to prevent this?
One thing we can certainly do on fiscal side, both Brazil and Germany, and correct me if I'm wrong, both Brazil and Germany has a constitution like Article 4, if I don't know the number, that you cannot have retrospective taxes. It's constitutionally banned and unconstitutional. Well, India we do merrily. Now, changing contracts is like a changing tax laws. So unless we have this part of legal system and that you cannot have retrospective tax changes, retroactive tax changes. Similarly, that kind of discipline should come. You can't have retroactive contractual changing contracts. So basic requirement of You know, when we were trying to write a book, we were always thinking, next challenge for India is how India becomes mature market economy. That's what we thought. And one of basic aspects is sanctity of contracts. Contracts, without that, no investment can take place in a really sort of sustained basis. So you're absolutely right that the same thing happened in the case of what Andhra has done on solar contracts. And no foreign investment will come. Because if you break contracts, no market economy can function. So you're absolutely right, and beginning has been made, in my view, by having constitutional change, that the government itself ties its hand, it will not make tax changes which are retroactive because of contract. And incidentally, this is what happened when Chandu, I must mention this. When we're discussing this tax report, we had a discussion with Jaswant Singh, he was the minister that time. And on this, he was very emphatic. So this kind of commitment required at the political level, that he says, contract is a contract. Although there is, what is that, estoppel? Promissory estoppel. Promissory estoppel. He says to him it was sort of a dharma. So unless that gets internalized, that discipline, but it has to come from government itself. We ourselves break every day our promise.
So, hi. Yeah, hi, this is Jayant here. The question is, are we still pretending that trickle-down economic works? I would like Govind Rao to go take a shot at this. Question is open to all. Trickle-down economics.
Trickle-down economics. Trickle-down, does it work?
Well, I mean, yes and no. It depends on the quality of growth that you really have. If you really go according to comparative advantage, once Arvind Panagade asked me, Govind, if you want to do one policy reform, what would you do? I said, I will allow the markets to determine prices. So the basic thing is that you have distorted the system so badly that everywhere the government wants to go in and determine prices. You determine, drug prices. You say that this is a ceiling. Then obviously there is no research in, drugs that happens, because obviously in that. So you do need to have, have the principle of comparative advantage, where there is a possibility of trickle down much more. So ultimately it all depends on the quality of growth. So you do need to put in where, your employment, intensity is higher. And if you say that, if you have a labor law, for example, which has and then if you say that you will have, a small scale industry reservation, and, you have all this type of distortions you create, so the trickle down will be less because people would use more machines rather than labor.
Can I do one last question? Mr. Bhave, can I come
Yeah.
back on this?
You want to
just
comment
a
on
quick
this?
comment on this. There's some very important evidence that we should keep in mind. In the cross-country evidence, imagine that we define the poverty rate in an international comparable way as the percentage of the population that is below $1 a day of consumption. It turns out that 99% of the variation in the poverty rate between countries is explained by one number, and that is the median income. Okay, so let that sink in, that what you can do to the income of the 50th percentile of the country controls 99% of the destiny of the poverty rate. Everything else we do, poverty programs, redistribution, what have you, can at most potentially account for 1%. So in this book, we would really push the primacy of growth, that above all, what we need is a vibrant growth process in India where there is more prosperity, there is more investment. Lots of problems will get sorted out like that.
Yeah, I haven't read the book, so maybe you've already answered it, but there was an allusion to it. It's lovely to see policies at a macro level in good hands. My contention, and I'm making it a slightly more drastic than actually it is, how good is policy when the implementation arm is weak and not efficient? And why is it that the policy makers themselves have not initiated a reform of that arm of which they are part of? Basically, I'm saying, isn't the bureaucratic nature of governance the biggest stumbling block to the bestest of policies that you would come up with? And more surprising than that is why has not one heard of any major movement in that area?
The book talks about, Mr. Bhave, when he summarized the book initially, spoke about, Mr. Govind Rao, when he summarized the book, repeatedly referred to the ability of the state to do in the form of state capacity. So this, the statement that one often hears, it's a great policy, it's not being implemented well, I personally think is an oxymoron. Because you know the machinery that's going to administer the policy, and therefore, often what we call policy in India is a statement of good intentions, desirable outcomes. So this is not policy. Policy is about identifying clearly the problem that you want solved, making out a role for the state, then figuring out all the rest. And the question in terms of why is the polity, because I think a lot has been said about, I'm surprised Mr. Govind Rao said the one reform that he wanted was markets determining price. I thought even above that would be abolish the IAS. Because
I dare not say that.
I'm surprised. Because contrary to your clap, my point is the opposite. Go back to the design, find out what was the design of the bureaucracy, see, has the design been meddled with, and then come to the conclusion about, is this machinery delivering? Because it's a complicated question, and it's not a 1-minute answer at 8 o'clock that will answer state capacity. But if the state wantonly destroys its capacity, we have to collectively find the answer.
Special interest group.
No. Special interest group is an easy sort of... No, but the IAS doesn't reform itself. So why isn't the polity reforming the IAS? Because the polity is as much an interest group. So therefore, the answers are not, these one-liners. The answers are deeper. No, much more. It won't be, it's complicated in terms of the constitutional design, the economics. But yes, I think state capacity is the next serious issue that India needs to address. And if you have 1 minute, sir, I sort of thought of a couple of examples, even for things that, let's take an important former citizen of this city who's somewhere in UK, and the most celebrated sort of money laundering act case, that department which administers the money laundering act in 16 years has had one successful prosecution. One, exactly one. And that's because the guy took the bribe by check. There's a famous Jharkhand case where the prosecution has succeeded, exactly one case. And if you go and look at the legal machinery that advises the Enforcement Directorate in Karnataka, as of today, it is an assistant labor commissioner sitting in Chennai who is in charge of Bangalore prosecuting the most important money laundering case in India. Now, it's a very moot question. Why isn't this state, which is very keen on strengthening PMLA, not strengthening the PMLA enforcement machinery? I don't have the answer.
Okay, thank you very much. We wish the authors all success and maybe a sequel to this book. And thank you for your patience and the good questions that you raised. My thanks to the panel as well. Thank you.